Welcome back. We're talking about India-US relations as Prime Minister Narendra Modi meets with the US President Donald Trump. Let's get back to our panel right now. Haiyan, I want to ask you about defense cooperation between these two countries. As we've been mentioning, there has been an arms deal done here, drones and fighter jets from the United States being sold to India. How will these defense deals be seen in China?
I think that China has recognized that India is destined to want to strengthen its military power. And this is not new. If you look at the past decade, for example, between 2012 and 2016, India's arms import accounts for 14% of the global arms import. India has been the largest arms importer for a long time. And you know, what India has been buying primarily has been buying from Russia. Russia has accounted for nearly 68% of India's arms imports, and the US during the 2012 to 2016 period accounted only for 14% of India's arms imports, Israel accounting for 7%. As India tried to diversify away, not completely away, but diversify more towards its arms purchases from the West, including the US, Germany, and France. And I think there exists enormous amount of opportunities for the US military, for the US defense cooperation with India. So, you know, there's nothing China could do to stop India from wanting to purchase arms. You know, at some point, the US will become a major supplier to India. And also India wants to build manufacturing capabilities domestically through these joint ventures. I think that China is tracking the progress closely, but I don't think there's anything that China could do to prevent it.
Right. Sadanand, what will the impact of this be, the fact that India wants to diversify the sources of its arms and is now looking to the United States?
Yeah, now this is certainly something not new, and certainly that's something that is, you know, long predates this particular visit. You know, for the longest time, India was deeply dependent on the Russians, but for various reasons, partly because the Russians have proved to be quite unreliable, partly because of the closer US-India relationship after the signing of the nuclear deal in 2005. Increasingly, India is turning more and more towards the United States and other smaller arms suppliers such as Israel. Now, I mean, I agree largely that this is, you know, that this is not cause for alarm from a Chinese perspective, because if you look at the two countries' defense spending in perspective, even though India is the largest importer, it spends a lot less on defense than China, partly because it's a much smaller economy, but also the import numbers indicate the fact that India really doesn't have a defense production base to speak of its own. And therefore, it's a disproportionate amount of its defense spending on armaments is imports. And I agree completely with Haiyan that there is a desire in India to modernize its military. Of course, there's no question, despite all the sort of pieties that sort of are thrown out by diplomats, there's no question that part of that comes from a concern about China's growing capabilities.
Right.
And that is just part of an equation, and I think everyone recognizes that.
Yeah, on that point, Raymond, does the imports from the United States to India, does that change the strategic balance in any way in that region in South Asia?
Well, I think what's really new here is this co-production idea. It wasn't talked about publicly much in the summit itself, but behind the scenes there's a lot going on about the F-16. As you probably know, that production line is shutting down in the United States, and it has been offered really to India to do co-production in India. This would be a remarkable development, really, because it presents India not just as an arms buyer from outside, but a manufacturer that is integrated in global supply chains for defense production. And it goes back to being able to have a confluence between Make in India, Prime Minister Modi's thrust, and what Donald Trump wants, America first and jobs here. So if that could be worked out, it seems to me that that is a very significant development. Does it change balances of power? No, I don't think it changes balance of powers, but it's a very significant development.
I would agree that it's significant if it's worked out for precisely the reasons Ray mentions. I don't think it's going to happen, because I think that in India there's a very strong politically, it becomes very difficult for any government to accept anything that can be portrayed as second best. And the fact that you have the F-16 line that is coming to the end of its life means that opponents of this idea, which I think is a good idea, but opponents of this idea are going to portray this as sort of a hand-me-down. And so I'd be very, very surprised if it actually comes to fruition.
Raymond, I want to get back to you on another issue, and that is terrorism. It's been seen as one area where these two countries could cooperate. Both have been victims of terrorist attacks. I want you to take a listen to what President Trump had to say about that. Let's watch.
The security partnership between the United States and India is incredibly important. Both our nations have been struck by the evils of terrorism, and we are both determined to destroy terrorist organizations and the radical ideology that drives them. We will destroy radical Islamic terrorism.
In that respect, are these two leaders on ideologically the same ground here?
Well, I don't know if they're on the same ground, but there is a similarity in using the words about radical Islamic terrorism. And I think in India there is some hope that vis-a-vis Pakistan that there is going to be some further change in terms of how the United States treats Pakistan. Afghanistan was also brought up by both sides. The real question is whether or not India is going to look at terrorism and fight against terrorism to include ISIS, Al-Qaeda across the board, or whether that's really just a code word for what happens with Pakistan and by extension into Afghanistan. There's no question there's a lot of common ground, particularly in cybersecurity, the ability to work together on terrorism in the cyber world. So it's a commonality. It is though it's not a complete break with the past. I think that the message for this summit really was continuity. After all, President Obama had been willing to name Pakistan as a place which terrorism came from. Today, the Prime Minister was talking about no safe havens. And of course, again, that's a code word for you got to do something about Pakistan.
And Haiyan, China must be looking at this. It's been deepening its relationship with Pakistan.
Indeed, indeed. China's through its has always had a close relationship with Pakistan. The One Belt, One Road includes that $46 billion China-Pakistan economic corridor, and building the port, and that's one of the thorny things that perhaps has made India hesitate to immediately join on the One Belt, One Road wagon. But again, that close relationship with Pakistan hasn't prevented China from cultivating an all-rounded relationship with India, and particularly as these two economies being the fastest growing economies, being the neighbors, and with trade and FDI investment still at relatively low levels and has a lot of potential to grow, I don't think that the cooperation with Pakistan, between China and Pakistan, should in any way be a big barrier.
You want to say something, right?
Well, I was just going to say, I've been a big proponent of the fact that you have a triangular relationship between India for services, China really in terms of manufacturing of goods, and the United States in terms of technology and finance. And I still think that there is scope for that. Now, there's a lot to be overcome. I was one of those people who said that in regard to the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, that the United States should not have taken the very negative approach to it that it did. India went with China in that, is now very active in it. So I do think that relationship augurs well in terms of being able to address some of the security issues, particularly in Southeast Asia and the South China Sea.
Sadanand, I want to get back to the visit. And this Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, has one big advantage that not many leaders coming to this country have, and that is he has a big support base inside this country among Indian Americans. How does one explain that? He's really popular.
He's very popular. In fact, yesterday I was at a community event, which was kept quite low-key by Modi standards, which means that there were only about, 500 or 700 cheering people, as opposed to thousands. He certainly has a following. He's seen as someone who has helped put India back on the world map. He's seen as a strong and decisive leader and so on. What was striking to me about his comments yesterday in the United States was that they were aimed not at a US audience or even an Indian American audience, but they were aimed at a domestic audience. And it's very interesting to see how he has used this visit to sort of position himself and sort of back in domestic politics. But one quick thing on the terrorism point, it was striking for me that President Trump used the term radical Islamic terrorism. Prime Minister Modi did not. Modi spoke only in terms of terrorism, extremism, radicalism, he did not use the word Islamic. And the reason for that is very obvious. He has 170 million Muslims at home, and he has to be very, very careful with how he speaks.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat, but the